Today we're going to be covering Chapter 5 of Propaganda. If you want to follow along, you can, of course, just watch the video, or you can find the show notes at my website, howtoeatanelephant.xyz. You can also find a donate button there at howtoeatanelephant.xyz if you find what I'm doing useful. If you are following along, you can see that I've highlighted my notes in blue and the things that I've denoted as important and very important in orange and yellow. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below. And with that said, we can get into Chapter 5 of Propaganda. Bernays begins. The relationship between business and the public has become closer in the past few decades. Business today is taking the public into partnership. A number of causes, some economic, others due to growing public understanding of business and the public interest in business, have produced this situation. Businesses realize that this relationship to the public is not confined to the manufacture and sale of a given product, but includes at the same time the selling of itself and all of those things for which it stands to the public. Here we see, again, 100 years ago, talking about this public-private partnership between business and the public, or today it's often used as businesses and the government. It's a little bit different, but I would say it's certainly cut from the same World Economic Forum styled cloth. And interesting where they say it's not only just the manufacture and sales of products that they're interested in promoting to the public, but they want to sell itself, the business itself, and the things that which it stands. This is very much like selling the image, the brand, if you will. And this reminds me today of how corporations have become overtly political in the past decade or so, from things like the Black Lives Matter movement and the LGBT movement, particularly seen with the LGBT movement in the Pride Month and the rainbow flags and logos everywhere. We see the corporations, in my opinion, trying to just virtue signal. I think this is obviously mostly nothing to do except for pandering for more dollars in an ever-tightening economy. They want to just tap that last, 1% of people that associate themselves with the LGBT movement. We also see this in video game studios, where certain studios will edit their games depending on what region of the world it is selling in. So, for example, again using the LGBT, the LGBT flags in Spider-Man 2 were removed in the Middle Eastern release of the game. Now, not all studios do this. They're not all pandering for dollars. I simply say most are. And one example is Square Enix in Final Fantasy XVI. They did not release that game in Saudi Arabia because they wouldn't remove certain LGBT-focused parts of the game. And other examples include movies, where they're self-censoring LGBT content in places like China. Now, again, I said it earlier, and I'll say it again, that these corporations, I don't think they care one bit about LGBT or Black Lives Matter or whatever movement it might be. I really, truly don't think they care. They're just using that as a way to posture and virtue signal, to, give you the wink and the nod to the particular in-group, whatever group that might be. And I'm focusing here on maybe like what you might call like leftist organizations, but it goes both ways. It truly doesn't matter. And all they really want to do at the end of the day is increase profits. Bernays continues. 20 or 25 years ago, this would have been late 1800s, businesses sought to run its own affairs regardless of the public. The reaction was the muckraking period, in which a multitude of sins were, justly and unjustly, laid to the charge of the interests. In the face of an aroused public conscience, the large corporations were obliged to renounce their contention that the affairs were nobody's business. If today, big business were to seek to throttle the public, a new similar reaction would be similar to that of 20 years ago. It would take place, and the public would rise and try to throttle the big corporations with restrictive laws. Business is conscious of the public's consciousness. This consciousness has led to a healthy cooperation. And when he's talking about the muckraking period here, the major example, I think, is Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. It's not exactly on point here with what we're talking about, but this was a book where the horrors of the meatpacking industry and the treatment of what was then new migrant labor were laid bare for the public to see. The results ended up with a bunch of legal reforms. And we see kind of the same thing in the modern time, that the corporation doesn't actually care about treating the employees fairly or delivering a quality product. They only care about profit, and will only change when compelled, when their sins, as he said, are exposed. They likely find it easier to proactively virtue signal nowadays with their the current thing attitude to gain public support, rather than wait for someone to rake up their muck and then respond to that. Again, it just points back to what I was saying with the LGBT, Black Lives Matter, environmentalism, you name it. They simply want to kind of get out ahead of the bad news and stop you from boycotting them before you even get to that point. Bernays continues, another cause for the increasing relationship is undoubtedly to be found in the various phenomenon growing out of mass production. Mass production is only profitable if its rhythm can be maintained. That is, if it can continue to sell its products in a steady or increasing quantity. The result is that, while under the handicraft or small unit system of production that was typical a century ago, demand created to supply, today supply must actively seek to create its corresponding demand. A single factory, potentially capable of supplying a whole continent with its particular product, cannot afford to wait until the public asks for its product. It must maintain constant touch through advertising and propaganda with all the vast public in order to assure itself the continuous demand which alone will make its costly plant profitable. And here again we see that Bernays is admitting to what I was just getting at. At the end of the day, it's all for profit. They use the advertising and propaganda to assure that the public is going to demand their product. It's the same thing, like I said, with all of these movements and corporations backing them these days. Bernays continues, quote, the growth of newspapers and magazines having a circulation of millions of copies, and the art of modern advertising, expert in making the printed message attractive and persuasive, have placed the business in a personal relationship with the vast and diversified public. And again, we see this today. You just replace magazines and newspapers with things like social media, blogs, influencers, etc. Bernays continues, quote, an oil corporation which truly understands its many-sided relation to the public will offer that public not only good oil, but a sound labor policy. A bank will seek to show not only that its management is sound and conservative, but also that its officers are honorable men, both in their public and in their private lives. A store specializing in a fashionable men's clothing will express in its architecture the authenticity of its goods and services. A baker will seek to impress the public with its hygienic care observed in its manufacturing process, not only by wrapping its loaves in dust-proof paper and throwing its factory open to public inspection, but also by the cleanliness and attractiveness of its delivery wagons. A construction firm will take care that the public knows not only that its buildings are durable and safe, but also that its employees, when injured at work, are compensated. At whatever point a business enterprise impinges on the public consciousness, it must seek to give its public relations the particular character that will conform to the objectives which it is pursuing. And I say that things are quite different these days. It is more likely that the officers of a corporation are corrupt rather than honorable, and that they seem to use their public relations to hide this fact. Even the last line reveals that they only want to, quote, give its public relations a particular character, and not actually, although it could be possible, but they don't necessarily actually want to adopt this particular mode of operation. They simply want to present that character. In modern terms, I would say something like the optics or the narrative matters more than the objective reality. They don't care, let's say in the case of the bakery. Yes, the public wants the bakery to be clean, hygienic, what have you. But it's more important that the public believes that the bakery is clean and hygienic rather than the bakery actually being clean and hygienic. It's all about, as I said, optics, perspective, narrative. These are words you hear all the time. Bernays continues, the public has its own standards and demands and habits. You may modify them, but you dare not run counter to them. You cannot persuade a whole generation of women to wear long skirts, but you may, by working through leaders of fashion, persuade them to wear evening dresses which are long in the back. The public is not an amorphous mass which can be molded at will or dictated to. And here I feel like we see one of the lines where Bernays is just trying to basically cover his ass. I mean, he waxes on and on about how the thoughts we have are not our own, how even in private we are herd animals and we have the assumption that we make our own decisions, but we're actually at the beck and call of each propagandist's whim. Then he sprinkles a few crumbs like this, expressing how the public isn't completely helpless to propaganda. If you took this middle ground that the public is somewhat pliable for the whole book, I probably wouldn't even be making these recordings. But that isn't what he says, and he's very clear in his position. And I'm going to state again here from chapter 1, paragraph 1, he said, and I quote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes are formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of." So I don't really see how he can square that circle where he's saying that, like, we are ruled by an invisible government and then saying, oh, but we can't get women to wear long dresses. I think that he thinks they can get people to do whatever the propagandist wants them to. We can dance to whatever tune they play. And I think that's more applicable today, 100 years later, than it was back in the early 1900s. He continues, "The relationship between business and the public can be healthy only if that relationship is give and take." And I would say that that ship has totally sailed before this book was even written. Corporations take, that's all they do, they take, they are profit driven. And in fact, in the United States of America, corporations are legally obliged to maximize shareholder profits above everything else. And here's just a quick little quote from Wikipedia, obviously not the definitive answer for any of this, but in 1919, like 9 years before this book was published, Dodge versus the Ford Motor Company. It was a case that the Michigan Supreme Court, and they held that Henry Ford had to operate the Ford Motor Company in the interest of its shareholders rather than in a manner for the benefit of its employees or customers. And it continues a bit there, but that's the important part. The Ford Motor Company legally was obligated to act in the interests of its shareholders, particularly profit, and not for the benefit of the employees or the customers. So I don't think there's a relationship between the public where it's give and take, the business and public give and take. It's the corporation takes, and they are legally, in the United States, obliged to do so. Bernays continues here that, quote, "A jewelry store may complain that its patronage is shrinking upwards because of its reputation for carrying high-priced goods. In this case, the Public Relations Council might suggest the featuring of medium-priced goods even at a loss, not because the firm is desiring a large medium-priced trade as such, but because out of 100 medium-priced customers acquired today, a certain percentage will be well-to-do 10 years from now." Now, I can't argue with these tactics. It doesn't seem even particularly underhanded, but again, I reiterate that they are only doing what they think will maximize their long-term profits. They are, in this example, willing to take a loss today for better profits 10 years from now. And again, we still see this today in the much shorter term when stores will use things like loss leaders, where they sell an item at a loss to get customers into the store in the hopes that those customers might make other, more profitable purchases. The epitome of this is your Black Friday, where you have your doorbuster sales, people lined up around the block to get the $5 television. And while they're there, they spend a bunch more money on other things that aren't so deeply discounted. The major difference here is the short-term versus long-term planning. In Bernays' example, they were going to sell medium-priced items so that in 10 years, some of those customers might be well-to-do and spend on higher ticket items. But today, these corporations are helmed by CEOs whose compensation is often dictated by quarterly profits. So they will run the company into the ground in the long term, the complete opposite of what Bernays is saying, in exchange for higher short-term profits, and then abscond in their golden parachutes with their multi-million-dollar contracts. Bernays continues, quote, "The public relations activities of a business cannot be a protective coloring to hide its real aims. It is bad business, as well as bad morals, to feature exclusively a few high-class articles when the main stock is of a medium grade or cheap, for the general impression given is a false one. A sound public relation policy will not attempt to stampede the public with exaggerated claims and false pretenses, but to interpret the individual business vividly and truly through every avenue that leads to public opinion." I would argue that the entire point of public relations is to hide the real aims behind these virtue signaling businesses, the real aims being profit. But this, as unappealing as it may be, is only really a minor issue in my eyes. The real concern I have is that when you take this propaganda applied by bad actors with no morals, and you apply that to politics, in what might be unhyperbolically referred to as world domination, has been and currently is leading the globe into what I see as a dystopian future, if not even a dystopian current, depending on where you live. We're in mid-2024, and if you live in Israel or Palestine or Eastern Ukraine or Western Russia, Bangladesh right now, there's lots of places that are full-on, not dystopian future, but dystopian current. And again, I think world domination isn't a ridiculous phrase. It sounds very like James Bond supervillain-ish. But what else are these people at the World Economic Forum, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, the Century Club? It goes on and on. Like, these people are explicitly calling for global governance because they want to shape the world one way or another. They think they know it better than everyone else. So again, I don't think world domination is too strong of a term. And I do think it's funny that Bernays is saying it's bad morals. Like, what? 100 years later, 2024, like, I'd be happy with bad morals. We have downright evil as far as I'm concerned. Bernays continues, "While the concrete recommendations of the Public Relations Council may vary indefinitely according to individual circumstances, his general plan of work may be reduced to two types, which I might term continuous interpretation and dramatization by high spotting. The two may be alternative or may be pursued concurrently. Continuous interpretation is achieved by trying to control every approach to the public mind in such a manner that the public receives the desired impression, often without being conscious of it. High spotting, on the other hand, vividly seizes the attention of the public and fixes it upon some detail or aspect which is typical of the entire enterprise." And I think that continuous interpretation here is pretty straightforward. They want to control the message completely. Where high spotting, I think, would be, he gives an example later that I'm not going to quote here, but let's say you're building a new tall building. You might focus that it's 10 feet taller than the tallest building in that city to make it seem better overall. And you really want to hammer that it's taller, it's taller, it's taller over and over again to fix this idea that, well, it's definitely better than. He continues, quote, "The tendency of big business is to get bigger, Through mergers and monopolies, it is constantly increasing the number of persons with whom it is in direct contact. All this has been intensified and multiplied by the public relations of business. And I can't argue at all here that big businesses want to get bigger. We hear today a lot of things like, grow or die. And he talks about mergers and monopolies. And looking back, since we can see in hindsight over the last 100 years, we have lots of mergers that have led to monopolies today. Our media is controlled by a handful of parent companies. I think it's only 5. It might even only be 4 nowadays. Our retirement and investment, if you even have one, accounts are controlled by, again, a handful of ultra-powerful firms. Realistically, you can pick almost any industry and look at the companies in it, and you will often find numerous subsidiaries that all reside under a handful of umbrella corporations. And it's amusing to me that AT&T was broken up in antitrust suits that would absolutely pale in comparison to what companies like Microsoft and Google have today. Bernays continues, quote, "There is no detail too trivial to influence the public in a favorable or unfavorable sense. Public opinion is no longer inclined to be unfavorable to the large business merger. It resents the censorship of business by the Federal Trade Commission. It has broken down the antitrust laws where it thinks they hinder economic development. It backs great trusts and mergers which were excoriated a decade ago. The government now permits large aggregations of producing and distributing units, as evidenced by mergers among railroads and other public utilities, because representative government reflects public opinion. Public opinion itself fosters the growth of mammoth industrial enterprises. In the opinion of millions of small investors, mergers and trusts are friendly giants and not ogres because of the economics, mainly due to quantity production, which they have affected and can pass on to the consumer. This result has been, to a great extent, obtained by deliberate use of propaganda in the broadest sense. It was obtained not only by modifying the opinion of the public, as the governments modified and marshaled the opinions of their publics during the war, but often by modifying the business concern itself." And here we see that they use propaganda to change the public opinion, to trust mergers and mammoth industrial enterprises are a good thing. It would seem to follow that before this propaganda was employed, the public opinion of these, let's call them megacorporations, was negative. Then, via propaganda, it was changed to positive. It's pretty obvious that's exactly what he's saying, but this is another attempt at painting a picture where the corporations or the governments are following the will of the people, but the reality is that the propagandists cultivated the public opinion of the positive view of the megacorporation in the first place. So it's, again, disingenuous. I keep saying it, but Bernays is so disingenuous when he says, well, the businesses are just doing what the public says. Yeah, after you manipulated the public into saying what you wanted them to say in the first place. He continues, "But it would be rash and unreasonable to take it for granted that because public opinion has come over to the side of big business, it will always remain there. Only recently, Professor Ripley of Harvard University, one of the foremost national authorities on business organization and practice, exposed certain aspects of big business which tended to undermine public confidence in large corporations. He pointed out that the stockholders' supposed voting power is often illusory, that annual financial statements are sometimes so brief and summary that to the man in the street they are downright misleading, that the extension of the system of non-voting shares often places the effective control of corporations and their finances in the hands of a small clique of stockholders, and that some corporations refuse to give out sufficient information to permit the public to know the true conditions of the concern." And again, here they talk about the people being brought over, to come over isn't really as accurate as brought over, right, via their propaganda. Then he talks about, now this is quoting this Professor Ripley from Harvard, but he's saying that the voting power is illusory. It is downright misleading when it comes to financial statements. And the effective control is in the hands of a small clique. Now, is it any wonder why you would use propaganda, why you would be required to use propaganda to paint these big businesses as favorable when they engage in these kinds of tactics? And again, I'm wondering, where is the truth that Bernays and Scientific America were lauding only a few chapters ago? Again, illusory, downright misleading, effective control in the hands of a few. It doesn't sound very truthful to me. Over the next few paragraphs, he speaks about how there might be some anti-business trends that are going to foment, hypothetically. And his response to this is, quote, "The Public Relations Council should anticipate such trends of public opinion and advise on how to avert them, either by convincing the public that its fears and prejudices are unjustified, or in certain cases by modifying the action of the client to the extent necessary to remove the cause of the complaint." Now we see here again in his weasel words, he says convince the public, not prove to the public or show the public, not do what the public is telling you to do, but convince the public that its fears and prejudices are unjustified. He continues, quote, "A merger may bring into existence huge new resources, and these resources, perhaps amounting to millions of dollars in a single operation, can often fairly be said to have been created by the expert manipulation of public opinion. It must be repeated that I am not speaking of artificial value given to a stock by dishonest propaganda or stock manipulation, but of the real economic values which are created when the genuine public acceptance is gained for industrial enterprise and becomes a real partner in it." And he keeps on saying this, honest propaganda, not dishonest, not stock manipulation. But I don't think this, like, even if we grant him this position that 100 years ago this was the case, you cannot argue anymore that honest propaganda exists. I would even go so far as to say honest propaganda would just be called information. The example, I think last chapter, he talked about toothpaste. You don't need to propagandize someone that toothpaste works. The proof is in the pudding. Like, if there's two groups of people and one is brushing their teeth with toothpaste and the other is not, the toothpaste using group is going to have better outcomes. You don't have to propagandize anyone. You can see the clear outcome. And again, by his own truthfulness, you don't need to, or you shouldn't need to, manipulate people if you're speaking straight up, plain, truthful information. He goes so far to talk about we're not artificially manipulating you, or we're not using dishonest propaganda, we're not manipulating the stocks. And yet the whole book, isn't he not constantly saying the conscious manipulation of the masses? We're going to put the thoughts in your head, every belief you have, over and over and over again. He talks about manipulating people. But trust us, guys, we're not doing it dishonestly. Yeah, okay. He continues, "The growth of the big business is so rapid that in some lines, ownership is more international than national." Now, I want to get off course here for 1 second. I think this is important, but beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. Smith and Ricardo, two old economists, both made points that this internationalization of business would lead to societal declines. When a businessman outsources his factory for increased profits, he does so at the expense of his own nation's people and ultimately the very society he resides in. Today, we've reached a crescendo where these businessmen have outsourced or imported cheap labor to the point where many nations are economically crumbling. They themselves being the businessman, can nowadays escape to their wealthy enclaves to avoid the effects of their lust for profit while the citizens languish. And we can see this very acutely in the whole 99% versus the 1% slogans. Now, when Smith and Ricardo were writing about this, it wasn't so much that they could escape. So if you were in, let's say, 1800 and you were in the United States of America, if you outsourced your labor, you might increase profits, but where were you going to go? It was still, you wanted your community and your society to be thriving because that's where you resided. But nowadays, you can outsource everything and then hop on your private jet and go to, Monaco or wherever your wealthy enclave is. You can avoid the negative results of undermining the society where you used to live by just going to a new society and then gatekeeping it. Like I said, this is beyond the scope of this book, but it is very important nonetheless. Bernays continues, quote, "The new technique of public relations counsel is serving a very useful purpose in business by acting as a complement to legitimate advertisers and advertising in helping to break down unfair competitive, exaggerated, and over-emphatic advertising by reaching the public with the truth through other channels than advertising. When two competitors in a field are fighting each other with this type of advertising, they are undermining the particular industry to the point where the public may lose confidence in the whole industry. The only way to combat such unethical methods is for ethical members of the industry to use the weapon of propaganda in order to bring about the basic truths of the situation. Take, for instance, the case of toothpaste. Here is a highly competitive field in which the preponderance of public acceptance of one product over another can very legitimately rest in inherent values. However, has that happened in the field? One or two of the large manufacturers have asserted advantages for their toothpastes, which no single toothpaste discovered up to the present can possibly have. The competing manufacturer is put in the position of either overemphasizing an already exaggerated emphasis or letting the overemphasis of his competitor take away his markets. He turns to the weapon of propaganda, which can be effectively through various channels of approach to the public, the dental clinics, the schools, the women's clubs, the medical colleges, the dental press, and even the daily press. Bring to the public the truth of what a toothpaste can do. This will, of course, have its effect in making the honestly advertised toothpaste get to its real public. Propaganda is potent in meeting unethical or unfair advertising. And here I was actually just talking about the toothpaste. Shouldn't these false claims by the initial manufacturer be seen as being false in time? Like if he tells you that the toothpaste was going to whiten your teeth, but after you use several tubes, your teeth were no whiter, would that not be enough for the free market to determine that these claims were false? Bernays seems to be stuck on this idea that the masses are so stupid that they can't figure out anything for themselves. If you make some false claim that your toothpaste has wonderful teeth whitening abilities, the masses are so stupid they'll never figure it out, and they'll just keep using it. They're just too stupid to ever figure it out, unless Bernays or some other propagandist sets their story straight. And again, I'm keep belaboring this point, but wouldn't the actual truth of the product trump any advertising, ethical or otherwise? He continues, quote, "Years ago, when the country was smaller and there were no tremendous advertising machinery, it was comparatively easy to get countrywide recognition for a product. A corps of traveling salesmen might persuade the retailer with a few cigars and a repertoire of funny stories to display and recommend their article on a nationwide scale." And he says years ago this was the way it was, but this is exactly how it is today. Maybe not exactly, but very similar. If we look at the pharmaceutical industries, and likely many other industries, their salespeople offer things like, oh, here's some free tickets to the ball game, or a kickback for every prescription written. And before you know it, this leads to something like, I don't know, an opioid epidemic. Like that's exactly what happened. The doctors were incentivized to prescribe these opiates through salespeople, and we ended up literally with a drug epidemic. And we're still reeling from those results today. Now, Bernays continues. I'm not going to quote the next part. He gives a big excerpt from this speech by this guy, Mr. Cheney, the vice president of the American Exchange and Irving Trust Company of New York. And he recounts these details about how there's inter and intra-industry competition. Now, it's obvious, like the toothpaste manufacturers are competing. Do you buy brand A or brand B of your toothpaste? But he gives less obvious examples. For one example is the textile industry versus the heating industry being in competition. So if you buy warmer clothes, you're going to need to run your furnace less. And more keenly, you can see that this inter-industry competition is in high effect in foods. We are literally limited in how much we can eat, but we have access to a plethora of competing foods. That was true 100 years ago, and it's even more true today. If I eat more meat, he goes on to say, the fish industries might go bankrupt. If I eat more vegetables, the meat industries may suffer, and vice versa. And again, we see this competition still today, but it's been really expanded to vie for our attention, not what we eat. For example, are you a Facebook user or an Instagram user? Our time, our attention is, like how much food we eat, literally limited. You might only have a few hours per day to use these social media sites. You can't use all of them. Bernays continues, if low price is the only basis of competition with rival products similarly produced, there ensues a cutthroat competition which can end only by taking all profit and incentive out of the industry. The logical way out of this dilemma is for the manufacturer to develop some sales appeal other than mere cheapness, to give the product, in the public mind, some other attraction, some idea that will modify the product slightly, some element of originality that will distinguish it from other products in the same line. And we also still see this today with trying to make your product more, let's say, luxury than other products. I've recently read a few books, the first two books of Alex Hormozy, and he focuses on this differentiation versus cheapness pretty extensively. His example is there can only be one cheapest product, and being the second cheapest is not worth anything, because the people buying purely on price, they're going to buy the cheapest one, not the second cheapest one. On the other hand, if you can differentiate upwards, you can be much more expensive, but you're also offering something that none of the other competitors can offer. So in this regard, I don't think Bernays is wrong at all. And here he continues over the next few pages. Bernays explains how the hat industry was manipulated similarly. He talked about the velvet industry a few chapters ago. It's basically a similar story. But at the end of the day, it really is, get prominent people to display and talk about your hats in the media, rinse and repeat, profit. Or the pianos he talked about last chapter. Same thing. Get prominent people to display your product or talk about your service, and then reap the profits. He finishes off with, quote, amusement, too, is a business, one of the largest in America. It was the amusement business, first the circus and the medicine show, and now the theater, which taught the rudiments of advertising to industry and commerce. The latter adopted the ballyhoo of show business, but under the stress of practical experience, it adopted and refined these crude advertising methods to the precise ends it sought to obtain. And this is really a stinger at the end of this chapter, because amusement being big business in America today, and really the whole world, the amusement industry is massive. And we see today that entertainment and advertising clearly go hand in hand. We have, let's say, celebrity and athlete endorsements that are worth millions and millions of dollars, because these certain faces alone will get fans to buy this or that. It goes the other way as well. You can see a rudimentary product placement. For example, you might see a Ford car or only Ford cars in a movie, and you can be almost assured that Ford paid or at least donated those cars to have their product slipped subconsciously into the moviegoer's mind. It's like a commercial that you can't really click away from because you're watching the movie. You're not even really looking at the car. It's just, like I said, subconsciously being shown to you. And people are aware of this today. But there's a third, more insidious technique that is a lot more popular today, and it's newer, called native advertising. Now, this is more commonly known as sponsored content, And it's when an influencer, as an example, an influencer does a review of a product, and they make it seem like they aren't getting paid to give the review. Now, even if the segment is explicitly noted as being paid for, every other aspect of this review is going to appear the same as other content on that channel. And so it puts you in a disarmed position where the viewer forgets that they're watching a paid advertisement, even if they were explicitly told this is a paid advertisement. So I hope that Bernays goes a little bit more into this, but it's a very useful technique that at some point I want to do a separate video just on that to show people how a lot of young people particularly say that they're immune to advertising when they're being advertised to in such a way that they don't even realize it. It's really breathtaking. Well, with all that out of the way, if you want to look over these show notes without having to go through the video again, you can find them at howtoeatanelephant.xyz. If you liked the video or have any questions or comments, you can leave them below. I'd love to hear any feedback you have. If you really liked the video, you can find a donate button at howtoeatanelephant.xyz. And if you think this was somehow useful, but you don't want to donate or you can't donate, that's fine. But I would love for you to share the video to anyone that might find it interesting. That would be greatly appreciated. And with all that said, I'd like to thank you for your time and attention, and hope you have a good night.